ETL testing of a Snowflake Data Lake. My name is Eric Smythe. I'm the Director of Partner Alliances at RTTS, the parent company of QuerySurge. I'm joined by Rashad Evans, QuerySurge's Director of Product Support, who will be providing the demo, and Michael Calabrese, our Senior Solution Architect, who will be answering any questions that you may have. This is the second session in our four-part series on data validation and ETL testing. Each webinar's target time frame is 30 minutes. Our goal is to keep them short and to the point. We'll be providing the recordings of all the sessions at a later date. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A panel. We'll answer as many questions as we can after Rashad's demo. Also, please use the web sessions chat feature to alert us if there are any issues seeing or hearing the session. Thanks again for your time and participation. And now let's get started. I always like to start with the QuerySurge business case. We know that executives make critical business decisions based off their BI and analytics reports, and the assumption is that the underlying data that's fed into these reports is accurate. But due to work with customers, we know that's not always the case. Bad data can be introduced into the architecture that can affect the accuracy and validity of those reports. How does that happen? Well, data comes from many different sources that can be ETL'd into one or more data warehouses. That information rolls up to data marts and eventually to the reports. At the same time, there may be a data lake in the architecture that's used for ingestion and curation of data. There may be a data migration project going on, as well as ERP systems that are feeding data to the warehouse as well as the reports. Anytime data is moving from one component of the architecture to another, there's a possibility of a defect or bad data being introduced. And that's a challenge that QuerySurge helps solve. QuerySurge is the smart testing solution for automated validation and testing of data. Our use cases are listed here: data warehouse ETL testing, big data testing, DevOps and continuous testing, data migration testing, BI report testing, as well as enterprise app ERP testing. Today, we're going to be focusing on data warehouse ETL testing for a Snowflake Data Lake. We have over 170 customers in 30 different countries. This is a sample list. We have a more extensive list on our website. But one of the things I always like to point out is if you take a look at some of these companies, it really spans all different vertical markets. So no matter what business you're in, you're collecting large amounts of data, and you're probably looking for a way to automate the testing of it, and all these companies chose QuerySurge as their solution. How does QuerySurge work? Well, we have a concept of a test where we can specify two endpoints. You'll specify a source system, which could be a data warehouse, a data lake, traditional database, mainframes or flat files, and a target system that might be a data warehouse, big data store, or a BI report. And at the time of execution, what QuerySurge will do is we'll request data from both source and target systems, retrieve that data back into tabular result sets, and it will look to compare every single cell of every single record, and then provide metrics and analytics around those results. QuerySurge can connect to over 200 different types of data stores. We come bundled with a bunch of drivers, but for any of the others, typically you can just deploy a JDBC driver onto a QuerySurge agent, and you're good to go. Today, we're going to be doing that and focusing on Snowflake as one of the systems we'll be testing. Some of the benefits of using QuerySurge for a data ETL project: QuerySurge helps validate your data 1,000 times faster and can test 100% of all your data. You can use QuerySurge to test across many different platforms, whether it's a data lake, data warehouse, traditional database, or any other type of data store. You can integrate your automated test executions into your existing data pipelines and help analyze your data with data analytics and data intelligence reports that QuerySurge provides. The use case we're going to look at today is we're going to be working with a source system that's going to be an on-premise Oracle database, and we're going to be looking to move data to a Snowflake data warehouse. Now, typically, there'll be some type of job that's going to move that data, whether it's a migration or whether it's a delta of some of the data records you're going to be working with. And then what QuerySurge will do is after that job runs, it will make requests to both source and target systems. It'll send the queries necessary to pull the data back, and then QuerySurge will grab those results and do an analysis and tell you if there are any discrepancies that occurred during that process. And as an optional step, QuerySurge can also send out automatic email notifications to let you know if there are any issues. So that's our high-level overview. Now I'm going to turn the session over to Rashad Evans, and he is going to be conducting today's demonstration.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Much appreciated. Today, we're going to be discussing a few use cases that our customers and prospects will encounter when needing to test against the Snowflake data warehouse. I'm going to be sharing my screen in just a moment. But typically, as Eric said, you will be testing against your source typical on-prem data warehouse. In this case, we're going to be looking at an Oracle data warehouse, and then we are going to be moving that data from the Oracle data warehouse into Snowflake, which has actually been already done for us. What you'll see here on my screen are the tables that we're going to be working with today. We have 5 tables that reside in our Oracle data warehouse: customer, order, address, orders, revenue, state lookup. And that data has already been migrated over to our Snowflake system. And in this case, we have a Snowflake dev schema, and in the sales database, we have the same tables that we just saw in our Oracle data warehouse. The tool that I use to extract and load the data is called Matillion. They offer a data loader tool that allows you to do that. So now what we need to do, since the data has already been migrated, is quickly generate tests that will be able to exercise the data migration process that we just encountered. With QuerySurge, you have the ability to do that specifically with migrations in a quick and robust way. The first thing that we're going to do when we get into QuerySurge is create a Snowflake connection. And the Snowflake connection has been made easier in later versions of QuerySurge because now we have an entry for it. So we will navigate to our administration module. We will then click on our connections, and we can see that we already have our Oracle connection. This is going to be our source data warehouse from which we are pulling the source data. And then we're going to create a Snowflake connection. You can do that by clicking the Add button. And what we're going to do is give this connection a name, Snowflake Dev. And in our data source dropdown, we'll select the Snowflake option here. On the next slide that we have here, what we'll need to do is enter account details for the Snowflake implementation to which we are trying to connect. And now for the account name, what we would simply do is enter just the account portion of our Snowflake data warehouse. We do not need to enter the full URL as you would see it in a browser. Simply take the portion of the account name and enter it into the account name field here. And then we would enter in the credentials that allow us to actually access And then on the next screen, it'll ask us some additional information about the particulars of the Snowflake environment to which we want to connect. Which warehouse do we want to connect to? What's the database to which we want to connect? And finally, the schema that we want to use that resides in our Snowflake warehouse. The next screen just simply allows us to confirm the information that we've already entered in. We can run a test connection to make sure that the connection has actual valid information. If it does not, it will come back with a failed status and possibly an exception message. Luckily, in this case, we have a pass situation, so we know that our connection information is good. Now, what do we want to do? We want to be able to quickly create these query pairs from the migration that we just performed. And in order to do that, we have a feature called the Query Wizard, and it can be found in the top navigation on the Design Library option, and you click the Launch Query Wizard option. And the Query Wizard option is a UI-based way of creating query pairs without having to actually code it yourself. And I'm going to go through this so you know exactly what I mean. When we click on the next screen, it offers us the capability to select the source and target connections for which we want to create our query pairs. In this case, again, our source is going to be the Oracle data warehouse. And since we migrated to Snowflake Dev, I'm going to select the connection that I just created. And what you'll see here is that will show you the number of tables that are available to the credentials that you use when you set up your connections. In this case, just over 2,000 on the Oracle side and about 111 on the Snowflake side. And this tells us which tables will be available to us when we're doing our selections. The next page will show us the types of comparisons that we can generate. The first is the row count comparison, which simply does a select count star. This is great for things like unit testing to make sure when developers are providing or performing their migration, they can quickly get counts. The next is a table level comparison, which performs a select star against the source and target data stores. But what we're going to show here is the column level comparison. The column level comparison will allow us to see which columns and select which columns we want to perform the comparison on. The first data items that we'll see are the schemas that are available to us. And this is great because we can actually select multiple schemas and have multiple tables available from all of those schemas that we select. In this case, we only want to select the sales schema. And then what we'll see here is the capability to access our tables that are available to us. And in this area, what we'll do is create relationships between the source tables and the target tables on which we want to perform comparisons. In this case, all we'll have to do is simply drag from the source table to the target table area and create a relationship between those items that we want to compare. And what that does is it opens up the column relationship area here for us to perform the same activity to create the column relationship. So we can simply drag and drop from the source and target to create our relationships. However, in a migration, typically our column names are going to be the same. So what this offers is the ability to auto-link the columns that have the same exact name on the source and the target side. And that feature is here on the top right-hand side. It's called the auto-links column. And when I click it, you'll see that the remaining columns on the source and the target that have a matching name, a relationship will be created for them. These two columns did not create a relationship because there was no matching source column. What we can also do here is select what we call a shared key. And a shared key defines the unique identifier of your record set in that particular query pair. So we'll select order number here. And then we can do the same thing for the other remaining 3 tables that we want to perform the comparison on. Again, we generate the relationships. And as you can see, down on the bottom left-hand side and the right-hand side, as we create the relationships, the queries will be built for you. So if I auto-link the columns, right now we have a select star, but after I auto-link the columns, we now have the column names that we're looking to test. Again, I will select our shared key, and then I'll do the same thing for the remaining 2 tables that we have here. Now, what I want to do is simply go into the next field that we have here. And this will ask us, where do we want to save the assets that we are about to create? In this case, in the query pair library, we have a set of folders. So I'm going to select a parent folder in which I want to create a new folder that will contain my new query pairs. And in this case, the folder I'm going to create is called Snowflake Migration. It also gives you the ability to create a test suite. And the test suite is where we'll be able to perform our execution. So I want to add those query pairs that I'm creating to a new test suite, and we'll also call that Snowflake Migration. When I click next, it'll give us a screen that allows to verify the information that we've just created. We'll click create, and it'll automatically create those assets for us. And so once we go into our actual design library, what we'll see here is that we now have a new folder called Snowflake Migration. It contains all 4 query pairs for our migration testing that we just created with the wizard. And you can see if I click into one of them, it has the source Oracle connection and the target Snowflake connection, as well as the queries that we're looking to run. And it's very similar for the remaining query pairs that we have here as well. So what we can do now is go to our scheduling module, and we'll also see the second portion of the auto generation is that it created a test suite for us that also includes all of the query pairs that we created using the query wizard. So instead of having to manually create the individual query pairs and then manually create the test suite that we're going to use to run the query pairs, all that was done for us. So as soon as we're done, we can simply right click on the new test suite, click run now. We're going to go ahead and change the name to dev, and then we'll run this and put this on the queue immediately for execution. And that's how quickly after our migration is done that we can generate tests and run these tests in QuerySurge without having to put in a lot of upfront effort in terms of manually creating query pairs. As you can see, the execution is going on as time goes on, and we'll be able to click into our test suite and look at the outcome of each one of our query pairs. In this case, all of our query pairs have passed, so our migration process is quick. And it's complete. We have 100% passing and validation for our migration process, and all of that was done in under minutes. So you can see how quickly and in bulk you can create these query pairs and test suites and run them and quickly validate that your migration process happens. The next thing that I want to look at in terms of use cases are ETL testing. ETL testing is a little bit different than data migration testing because ETL testing can require transformations be applied to the source data before it gets loaded into the target data warehouse. In this case, if we go back to our databases, we'll see on our Oracle side in the customer table that there is a column called full name. Now, this column contains both the first and last name for the customer, and the format is last name, comma, space, first name. But the specifications for our ETL process for this particular field dictates that in our Snowflake instance, what we want to do is be able to split that field and show that there is an individual column for first name and an individual column for last name. So what do we have to do in QuerySurge is we have to create a query pair that will implement the logic that transforms our single column on our source into two columns on our target. So if we go back into our design library and we look at our customer query pair, what we'll see is we'll have to create a manual query pair to implement this transformational logic. And on the source side, what you have seen is that we implemented Oracle functionality to be able to parse through the full name column to return just the first name portion of the full name as the first column. And then the second column does the same type of thing on the full name column to extract the last name portion. And then we'll just do a straight pull on the target side because that data has already been loaded by our ETL code. So what we'll do here is we'll select the Snowflake dev environment connection. We'll go to our design time run. We won't run this as a test suite. We'll run this as a design time run. This is an area that test developers can use to run one-off executions to make sure that it's running the way that we expected. And as it's running, it'll show us where we are in our execution phase, whether the source and target query have executed, when they've executed, if the results analysis has executed, and some additional pieces of information here. And once it completes, we'll get some summary information about the execution. We'll see 10,000 rows on the source and the target. We have a passing outcome, which means all of the records came back as expected. 0 fails down at the bottom. And we can quickly inspect our result sets and see that the results on the source match the results on the target. And in our failures tab, we have 0 items here. So we correctly extracted the first and the last name from the full name column on our source side and was able to verify that the ETL code did exactly the same by running this test. The third use case that I want to talk about is promoting code to higher environments. There are a lot of situations where you have a data warehouse that has different environments within the data warehouse. You'll have a dev data environment, you'll have a test data environment, and then you'll have a prod data environment. And once testing and development has been done in one environment, you typically promote code to the next environment until you get to the production level environment. What QuerySurge offers to allow you to more quickly implement testing for these different environments instead of having to create additional assets for these environments is what we like to call the connection override behavior. So what I'm going to do is navigate back to our test suite, and you'll see that the test suite still has all of the query pairs that we developed for our dev environment. However, now, since we've done our testing in our dev environment, I want to run this in our test environment instead. Instead of going back and creating new query pairs or going back and creating new test suites, I can simply click on the Properties tab of our test suite and investigate this connection override behavior section. By default, the option is Do Not Override, which means it will utilize the connection that was set at the query pair level. So if I go back to my design library and I look at my migration query pairs, you can see that the connection here is Snowflake Dev on the target side. However, if I wanted to change that connection just at the test suite level, I can select our test suite option, and then it'll give me the sections or the connections on which I want to change at the test suite level. In this case, I simply want to change this connection to the dev, from dev to test, but I do not yet have a test connection. So I'll navigate back to my administration module, simply copy the connection for the dev environment that I already have, and I'll just rename it to test so that we have a different nomenclature. And then I'll open this test connection and simply navigate to my database and change the database, because I'm no longer testing in dev, I'm testing in test, and simply change that. And that's how quickly we can update our connections. I'll just run a quick test connection to make sure that the connectivity is fine here. And once that comes back as passed, I'll save this and be able to use this connection in the test suite that I'm running now. And so we got a passing situation. I'll go ahead and save it, navigate back to our scheduling module, and now be able to select Snowflake Test at the suite level, click Save. And then when I run this now, again, change this to, instead of dev, use test. And I'll automatically be navigated back to my run dashboard. And you can see my test environment testing has already kicked off. I didn't explain these graphs, but I'll do that now. What you'll see is that there's a snapshot graph that'll show you where you are in your execution phases at any point in time. You have some graphs that show you where you are in your execution over time. And then you have some information about the query pair executions on the right-hand side, the start time, the end time, and the like. But obviously what I want to do is take a look at my executions. And we can see that we've already had some query pairs that have completed and have come back. And we do have some failures. So our dev testing showed that we had 0 failures when running in the dev environment, but our test Snowflake environment does have some issues. And in this case, we can see when going to the failures tab that we have a record that did not make it over from our source. So on our source side, left-hand side here, for the state table, Washington, D.C. didn't make it over. That's kind of understandable. It's not quite a state, so maybe there was some code mishaps that did not bring this data over, and you can see that it's empty on the target side. If I look at our orders table, we can see some additional failures here. And in this case, what it looks like is that the first name did not make it over, into our Snowflake data warehouse, hence all of the blank values that are on the target side and the highlighting of which values that have failed. So these were just some of the use cases that our customers and our prospects have been encountering, and we wanted to give you a quick demo on how you can tackle those challenges. I want to thank you for attending the demo for Snowflake today, and I'll pass it back to Eric.
Thank you, Rashad, for that excellent demo. Michael Calabrese, our Senior Solution Architect, will now answer your questions. Please type any that you may have into the Q&A window if you haven't already done so. Turn it over to you, Mike.
All right, thank you, Eric, and great job, Rashad. It was a wonderful demo. Some of the questions that we had come across during the session here is one of the first ones I'll start with. Does QuerySurge come with the driver for Snowflake? So the answer to that is that the JDBC driver can be downloaded from the Snowflake documentation and their Maven repository. Once you do have that driver, you can deploy it to any of our QuerySurge agents to establish that connection. And as Rashad showed in his demonstration with our connection wizard, it easily walks you through the parameters you need to set up to establish that connection to your Snowflake instance. One of the other questions that we have here is, can QuerySurge be used to test data that is returned via a service or API? The answer to that is yes. QuerySurge does have multiple approaches in order to be able to do that. We do have knowledge-based articles that detail how to create a custom function to be able to access these different APIs or web services. And we also have availability, and this is outlined in our knowledge-based articles as well, via our partner, CData, technology partner CData, who does provide drivers to be able to access different API technologies. Another question that has come across is what happens if the transformation fails, as in no commas in the full name. I believe that for that example, we did have an all pass, but Rashad showed in the last example there, we do have failures that show up on the failures tab when reviewing the results. So whether you're missing a record or an individual field shows a difference there, you can be able to identify that within QuerySurge itself. We also have another question is, can QuerySurge query semi-structured data in Snowflake? And the answer to that is yes. Snowflake has and stores semi-structured data in what we call a variant data type. And in their documentation, they do explain how to be able to access the data that may be displayed in either JSON or Parquet or other semi-structured formats. And the techniques to traverse those different data points can all be applied to your query pair to extract that data in there. And another question is, when we select a schema in a target connection, I'm not sure, and let's see, second part here is how to make a connection with the data lake as data warehouse service in a cloud. So yeah, we do support a number of the different cloud technologies that are out there, whether you're working with Azure, AWS, or Google. Our knowledge base does go into detail on how to set up connections to whatever data lake storages you may be working with there. And actually quite useful too if you're looking to maybe test some of your staging tables that you have in these different cloud technologies as they move into Snowflake. You can verify that as well with QuerySurge. One of the final questions I'll take here is there any limit imposed on the amount of data that can be tested from your Snowflake instance? So I'll say that QuerySurge does not impose any inherent limits on the amount of data that you can query and extract from the data sources that you set up. It really comes down to the hardware that you have QuerySurge installed on and the resources available for your QuerySurge instance to be able to handle the data that you are testing. And I think that does it all for the questions. So Eric, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Michael and Rashad. That wraps up our Q&A session. Thanks again, everyone, for your time and participation today. We'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone with a link to the recording and our contact information if you have any additional questions. And next week, we'll be presenting another webinar titled How to Build a DevOps for Data Testing Pipeline from Jenkins to JIRA. So if you haven't registered, please feel free to do so. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and have a great rest of your day.